Hello and welcome to Plague Tapes 113 on the 31st of October 2021. I say that because I really do need to emphasize what the time is, because it just goes on and on and on.
That was the date, but good enough.
Yeah. I was so confused that last week I thought that the plague started in 2019, I think I said that. And it did start in 2019, of course, but it didn't arrive here until March of 2020. Anyway, Andrew, yes, figures are going up again. Yesterday we almost broke 3,000, is that right?
2,966. So, yeah. 5-day average was 2,389. So, Neffet had originally projected we might hit 3,000 cases towards the end of November, and instead, right at the end of October, we'd almost done it. Now, that's a single day cases, and there was probably a backlog in there. So it might have been 2,600 swabs, but it looks like things are getting worse faster than they anticipated. Couple more days data will tell us that, and of course it's actually a little bit too early to see any effect from the nightclubs opening yet. That's more like Wednesday is when I would start to expect to see any effect of that, so that will be interesting.
So the trajectory is looking worse, because wasn't the whole premise on this was we were just going to play through, we were going to get a wave, and the wave was going to hit us, the top of the wave was end of November.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
and now it looks like that wave is bigger, or it's going to hit earlier.
It's looking, well, I mean, hard to distinguish which of those would be which, but it's looking like it's bigger than what they thought was the most likely one. Now, they had, as usual, there was a range, so the higher ends of that range are much higher. The timing of the whole thing, like, there's been a bit of discussion around this, in that end of November timing for the peak doesn't really make much sense, in that there's nothing particularly happening that means there's a peak there and then it comes down. There's no proposal to introduce measures in mid-November and do something that could cause that peak to happen. And I mean, there's some people feel that it's based off primary school children being infected, but actually probably wouldn't be enough infected in that period for that peak to happen there, and certainly not in order for that to be what causes the peak. It would be have to be very much larger than 3,000 cases a day, because there's, I don't know, about 800,000 in that age group, 900,000.
Right.
So that November peak is a bit of a mystery. Basically, we haven't been told why that's there. So
is this November peak just something that they would like to see? Is this like a wish for Father Christmas? They'd rather see a peak in November so that we could just go on to December, have a Christmas unimpeded, and everything's going to be fine.
Well, okay, so that's
wishful thinking.
That is a possible interpretation that would make some sense as wishful thinking, because the obvious problem we're going to face is, first of all, it's actually worth pointing out something interesting. Cases have gone up, but actual hospitalizations and ICU have kind of plateaued again over the last few days. So kind of too high. So, like ICU yesterday was 92 in ICU, and there were 500 in hospital as of this morning. Right, it's always a little bit higher at the weekend. But that's not that much higher than where it was 2 weeks ago. And the interesting detail I noticed within that is that, I track the percentage of cases that are being hospitalised a week later, and the percentage that go into ICU in about 10 days. And that hospitalisation figure has fallen. It peaked at about 4.6% about 2 weeks ago. And now it's back down to 2.6%, right? So you'll understand what this explanation is about in a minute. So why did that happen? One possibility is that what we're seeing is Neffet saying, things are going wrong. Well, let's go back a little bit further. We go back about 5 or 6 weeks. We have that period where everybody thinks it's coming to an end, and we're expecting normalization, all that sort of stuff. And I think what happened with that is a lot of people who were more high risk probably started socialising again because they had been told that it was much safer than it had been previously, right?
Yeah.
So the reason we then saw hospitalisations go up to 4.6%, which was like that's the highest I'd seen it in the entire time I've tracked it, was probably those people getting infected, right? And they were more likely to get hospitalised. So then there's the period then when NPHET are going, oh, this is going wrong. And I think what probably happened there was that the vulnerable groups went back into isolation, essentially. Now, I know my own parents' case, that's pretty much exactly what was happened. You know, like there was a month back, there was talk of having an 85th birthday party with, 20 plus guests at it. And now that's going to be a few family members. And that's a reaction to that. So I suspect that's probably what happened. And there's a lesson in there probably in terms of how this final phase of the pandemic goes out and messaging around it.
I think we've already blown that lesson though, haven't we?
Well, no, you see, this is where I'm going. So this gets to your wishful thinking idea that what they're hoping for is a peak at the end of November because that might clear the way for Christmas. Because, of course, the problem is if that isn't what happens, then Christmas stands to be a bit of a disaster again. Probably not as bad as last year, but, I would say no, not as bad as last year. But you'd have the similar problem that with everything open, nightclubs and open everything else. I mean, the gamble would say opening the nightclubs is that people who go to nightclubs are kind of like, 18 to 30 mostly. Like there's people outside those ages go, but it's mostly that. Which are generally an age group that's not hospitalised that often. So therefore, as long as they're just socialising with each other, then that's probably, the calculation you might make is that's not too serious. The problem is when you get into Christmas, you get the problem we had last year, which is you have people socialising together for 2 to 3 weeks, except in this case it's a couple of months, which builds up cases in that particular age group, and then they go and they visit the parents, the grandparents at Christmas, and that results in parents being infected, and that obviously has much more severe repercussions. Even in the case where people are vaccinated, we now know what's going to be true of some number that would not be inconsiderable if a lot got infected. So I think, that kind of might be what they're thinking about there.
But let's go back to the ICU figures. What about the 92 people that are in ICU? Is that still holding at a 2/3 unvaccinated, 1/3 vaccinated? It's like the August and September we have fairly solid figures for, and in both cases actually only 30% of those in ICU were fully vaccinated. So it's still around the same.
It's still around about 2/3 are not at all vaccinated. There's a few people got dose 1, didn't get dose 2. And the October figures are so far on course for that. I mean, in fact, they always show an even smaller percentage, but I think that's because it takes a while for the data to come through and it will be adjusted upwards. That's from looking at this, it looks to me that if you had the entire population vaccinated, then about 1 per 1,000 cases would end up in ICU. That seems to be what we're talking about at the moment. Which is kind of, that then depends on how many cases you have. And in fact, it's quite possible we're missing a lot of cases in fully vaccinated people at the moment.
Right. Okay, because the symptoms aren't that strong, or like...
Yeah. Like a mixture of people not feeling they're vaccinated, so they can't have COVID, so they don't get tested. Only getting tested if there's no close contacts aren't tested, although they're about to bring that back into antigen tests. But I mean, all those things would mean we're probably undercounting cases among vaccinated people. But the good news about that is that would probably mean that 1 per 1,000 vaccinated going to ICU might actually be half that. It might be 1 per 2,000. And actually, there's a big difference there because 1 per 2,000 probably would be manageable over going forward. So that's one stat. The less comforting stat is that about 60% of deaths are people who are fully vaccinated.
Right.
That is like I need to say that every time. That's still, in fact, very good protection, because that's 60% from 90%, 92% of the population, and it means 40% of deaths are coming from the 8% who aren't vaccinated. So get vaccinated, so that still holds there. But what it does mean, like, I think when I did some calculations on the figures they released on that for September, it looked to me that I think 93 people who died in
care homes again.
94 people who died in September had been fully vaccinated, right? So if that was a typical month, you're talking about 1,200 deaths a year. Yeah. If it continued at that sort of rate, and actually realistically, you're probably talking, with no measures in place, cases allowed to escalate, you're probably talking about double that or more. And it looks like there's a case fatality rate of 0.2% for fully vaccinated, which is about 2 people per 1,000. So with those figures, I mean, 1 per 1,000, 2 per 1,000 sounds very small. The problem is if you get 1 million people infected, then that's still a fairly significant number. And with endemic COVID, we're kind of expecting the sort of numbers we're going to see. The thing we don't know about those deaths, though, is to what extent those are deaths where COVID actually caused the death, and to what extent those are people at the end of life who caught COVID in that situation.
Do you have a breakdown in terms of demographics, though? Like age group?
Oh, average age, I don't have it here, but it's 81 or something.
Right,
it is,
okay, so it is that, yeah.
It's same as before. I mean, insofar as we can see, these are mostly... They don't give a vaccinated breakdown by setting, so it's hard to know.
Yeah.
But in terms of deaths, continue to happen in nursing homes and hospital outbreaks. So insofar as we can see, it's basically people who are vulnerable because of underlying conditions and age. And I like thinking.
So people were these are the same kind of people who would have died from pneumonia or something like that. I mean, this is like the end of.
Yeah,
the body's not really strong enough
to
fight it off at that stage.
Yeah, so I think there's 2 distinct categories really in that. One is people who actually are literally in the process of dying and happen to catch COVID. It may not even make any difference whatsoever to that process. But the second group
might speed it up. Yeah.
Yeah, but the second group is the more difficult one, because that's people who are relatively old and feeble, but they get COVID and they just can't, that's too much. That's what kills them. But, in those cases, they could still have lived for another year or 2 years or whatever else,
Yeah.
And in some cases, because if you think of some of the vulnerable groups, for instance, are people who've had transplants, organ transplants, remain... because you're on immunosuppressants and all that sort of stuff, vaccination isn't terribly effective anyway in those sort of cases. But, I mean, you get organ transplants, when they don't do those if they think you're going to die in 6 months anyway. They do them because they think they'll give you years of life that way.
Yeah.
So you've that group, you've people with blood cancers, you've, various groups where, people get these things and they kill them, but maybe they kill them in 5 years. Not in 3 weeks because they happen to catch COVID in the meantime. So you've all that sort of thing, I think, is happening.
Well, that's obviously a complicated picture to unravel. The 8% unvaccinated remains at 8%, does it? Or is there any... have we kind of stalled on the vaccination?
I mean, like, it's... I didn't do a calculation for last week. There was more vaccination than the previous week, but you're looking at maybe 10,000 people a week or something, And actually, I was thinking about it, if you simply think about it in terms of age and how many people went from 11 to 12 in a particular week, that's probably a chunk of that anyway, So there's no substantial.
So we haven't made inroads into the 8%.
Yeah, okay. I mean, we're now at the period of the pandemic where every week more people are getting infected than are getting a first dose vaccination, and that'll probably rise to being multiples of that.
Okay, and then we use this chart of how prevalent the disease is per 100,000. Where are we at now in terms of that? Are we beyond 600?
Yeah, we were. What were we yesterday now? I
mean, in the UK...
629, yeah.
Okay, so how would that compare with just to give me an understanding, how would that compare to the UK? The UK, the statistics
I'm not sure
the
the
UK are saying that 1 in 50 people have now got COVID.
Yeah, they're using a different method when they
Yeah.
do that, but in terms of the so they do measure cases per 7 days rather than 14 days, so it makes it a little bit hard to do a direct comparison. But essentially, Scotland is coming down and we're going up, and it looks like we'll probably cross over quite soon.
Right.
Northern Ireland is coming down very slowly, but we're going up quite fast. I suspect we're going to cross over. Like, I think yesterday we actually had more cases per 100k than the North did, but that's just one day.
Okay.
So I think we're going to cross over with that. It's entirely possible this time next month we will have a higher caseload than any of the individual parts of the UK and it as a collective body, basically.
So when are you predicting that? Within a month?
It's possible within a month. It could happen sooner, actually.
Right,
Because
the trajectory is faster than we expected.
Yeah, there are figures of. I mean, it's quite hard to understand what's happening over there as well, even apart from this thing with the labs not processing tests, possibly giving people false negatives. In that there's a lot of regional variation and movement within it, and London, for some reason, seems to have relatively low caseload, and some people are trying to work out why that's happening. Is it the case that they've now got so many people infected on top of the people vaccinated that that's having a downward pressure on cases? It could be. They've been doing that since June, July. Maybe they're starting to see results from that. However, at least there's been a few points in the last 2 or 3 months where people have gone, oh, look, the cases are coming down, so therefore that strategy is working out for them. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, they go up again. So
4 months of that strategy doesn't seem to have yielded much, to be honest, though, does it?
No,
Let's rip through it and let's see where it gets us. Okay, so then I actually had the pleasure and privilege of getting a COVID test this week, and the only thing that I noticed, it was obviously set up for a lot of numbers when I went down on Tuesday, but I got a box of masks, so I don't know why, but I mean maybe that's a sign that you should really wear a mask everywhere, and that because you don't know the results, you should be much more conscientious. Maybe that's a trigger. But in terms of the discussions coming from NPHET, is there what's the messaging about this now in terms of, because we've opened up everywhere, so, and the cases are continuing to go up, so is there some countermeasures that are being put out there, or is there some sort of plan? Because it doesn't seem like there's a plan.
There isn't really. I mean, no, there's two emphases, which, and actually three, I must go all three. So one is the basic behaviours of washing your hands, not going to work if you're sick, all that sort of stuff.
Personal responsibility, they love that one.
And personal responsibility
they
stuff.
lead
right?
with that,
and the idea that can have a small influence on the rate of growth, and perhaps could stop it. Secondly, which is a new thing they started messaging last week, and this goes back to what they were saying last Christmas as well, which is, look, just because you can do all these things now doesn't mean you have to do every single one of them all the time. That obviously the risk of going out to a nightclub 6 nights a week is considerably more than the risk of going out once. And so
I'm going to put that in as show some restraint.
Yeah, and
again, it goes back to personal responsibility, though.
Well, that this is the phase we're in, basically. And then the third thing they pointed out, but it wasn't. I don't think there's enough emphasis on this. Is that if you are going to nightclubs or you are doing stuff that's high risk activity, then you should avoid vulnerable friends and relatives, basically, in the period afterwards. So that you might be okay because you're vaccinated, but a relative.
Somebody who's susceptible or with underlying conditions, or somebody who's older doesn't.
Even if they have been vaccinated, may still be quite vulnerable. So you have that 2-week period where you should stay away. And if you remember, I mean, they tried that last year at Christmas. The suggestion that people coming back from England should eat their Christmas dinners in their bedrooms, and that was widely ridiculed by people. Then we have 2,000 deaths in the 2 months that follow. So I think there's there's a problem with all three of those messages in that people don't like them. They don't like the personal responsibility thing.
No.
But a lot of people also want things to be open. And unfortunately, the crossover between the people who want things to be open and the people who don't like personal responsibility is quite big. So there's kind of a population who want to be able to do stuff and not be told there might be repercussions to doing it, or not want to think. They don't want to think about it. I think there's quite a lot of stuff at the moment where people don't want to think about that, which is
also reflected in effort. They wish for a peak in November. That doesn't seem to be based on much. It's not just people who are.
Yeah, but I think the important thing, it's the difficulty. There is a big difficulty with this, which is you can understand why people are taking that attitude. They just want this to be over, and they don't want to hear that it's not over. They don't want to hear about cases.
Yeah.
They just want to go out. They want to do stuff.
They're probably not listening to this show.
And practically, they may not be. They kind of avoid vulnerable relatives type stuff's all well and good, but lots of people live with parents or whatever else. So they work with people. They work in healthcare settings like nursing homes, etc., etc., etc.
Reality is always much more complicated.
Yeah, and particularly in Ireland because we have a housing crisis.
Yeah, exactly. So you can't avoid people. You're living with your mum and your dad. So you may not want to be.
So that's not that much different from the situation we talked about last week or the week before. We're still in this position where you can sort of go, okay, I can understand people want stuff to be open. There are consequences to it, and there's a disconnect between that desire for things to be open and being willing to admit to the consequences. And to some extent, that disconnect will create more problems than could be otherwise. But it's also part of it isn't a disconnect. It's the way people live. Like, it's their housing. It's everything else.
Yeah.
And you do I had this feeling repeatedly that one of the issues with NPHET is they're all people coming from relatively well-paid jobs, where probably you don't have the same situation with overcrowded housing. On the abstract, they're kind of aware of it, but when you hear this advice being given out, you're kind of like, yeah, but how much of the population can actually follow that?
Yeah.
And if it's the case that a third can't, well then, what happens around that? Is this just one of the contradictions of the end of the pandemic, and that you're accepting there's going to be more casualties from that third? Is that what it is? So yeah, there's all that happening.
The way Ireland is set up, it's set up for the people who vote and the people who constitute constituents, and a lot of the time the much more marginalised can all just take a running leap because they don't vote for me anyway. That's often the way. But what's clearly shaping up in this is that it all falls back to personal responsibility. Politically, surely there's got to be some responsibility on they made the decision to open up the nightclubs.
Yeah,
we've already got figures going in the wrong direction.
Yeah,
in a way that's very worrying, and they've not really stated anything about that. Do you not reverse some decisions because of what's happening? Is there
so? But this gets us down to the problem we
talked about this before in terms of what you can do, but surely you could reverse decisions if you. And also, isn't there a point where you actually come out and say, we got it wrong to a certain extent? The whole normalization period, we got that wrong. Therefore, we are going to implement some sort of measures, and then it's the question of what those measures are.
Well, to an extent, that's why we still have vaccine certificates to access hospitality, right? All that was meant to go. So what they did is all the stuff that was meant to go, they stopped it, right?
They kept it.
So that's being kept at the moment, and I though there's lots of talk of, well, we won't have another lockdown, nobody wants to have one, etc., etc., etc. The key critical figure will be ICU occupancy, right?
Yeah, which is already at a third of our capacity or higher.
It's around a third. And my reading of what's been said around that is 200 is being taken as the sort of critical, occupancy level.
Right. Yeah.
Now we know from the January wave, that in fact we really ended up with 500 people in ICU, but 300 of those 500 went in ICU proper. They were in situations where there was, basically they over the summer they prepared the hospitals with kind of high flow oxygen equipment and things that could be had some aspects that were like ICU but went ICU. I think the crisis in the hospitals in January and February was far, far worse than anybody realised, except people who are actually working in them.
Yeah.
Because the reality was not only did you have your 220 COVID people in ICU and all your operating theatres turned into ICUs to help keep that together, but you had another 300 odd people who kind of should have been in ICU but weren't, and that's part of the reason why the fatality rate of people going into ICU in that third wave was something like 30 to 35%, when the earlier waves was about 20%. Right. So it's kind of like, I don't want to say it's substandard treatment, but it's a measure that everything that would normally be done couldn't have been done in that. So that's what makes me a little bit concerned about that 200 target, because are we talking about a 200 that's really 500 again?
Right.
I think we're probably not, but or is it 200 proper ICU? And when do we hit that?
It's interesting because you said I think, I hope, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of that going on too.
I'm reading State of Emergency at the moment, Richard Chambers' book on the pandemic, and it's his stuff on the crisis in the hospitals in January and February is interesting, in part because you realise just how much all the politicians freaked out. Because basically we were very close to being in exactly the same situation Northern Italy was at the start of the pandemic, where ICUs completely overran, and lots of decisions would have to be made that we just can't treat this person. So I said we kind of were doing that in a somewhat different form, but literally that your entire medical system would kind of fall apart. So from reading that account, we came very, very close to that, and they thought it was going to happen, but the tide turned just in time in terms of the impact of the lockdown. So
really interesting that.
Yeah, I don't think they'll want to play that game of chicken again. Basically,
But they have that kind of knowledge, and at the same time, they still make decisions like opening up nightclubs.
So that
there's a definite disconnect between their recent
there
actions.
There is and there isn't, right? Yeah. I think this is the difficulty. This is the okay. We have almost everybody vaccinated. What do we do? How do we get out of this? What happens next? And
we need to push on through. That's the break on through scenario.
So that's kind of, and it's like, as I said, it's you can sort of see what the thinking is, because it's different now with the vaccination. Like, what else do you actually do? So I think what we're seeing, what they're doing is this thing of going, okay, well, we're going to accept this much higher level of cases, quite a high demand on the health system, because we can't lock down again, because that just delays the thing for a bit. Now, personally, I think we are getting towards the point where actually delaying it for a few months makes sense, and in particular there's a crisis now in the children's hospitals. Not so much because of COVID, although it's playing a role, but I've talked about it a few times, RSV, this other virus that kids get hospitalised, there's lots of them. The wave of RSV at the moment is way above what it would normally be. And there are so many children hospitalised with that now that the Crumlin Children's Hospital, which is the main one in the country, has had to cancel a lot of other care, basically. So that crisis is already happening. So it's all it's all
to play for. It's great.
We're still living in the pandemic. That
is definitely.
But
the case.
The maths has all changed, and to an extent, the vaccination. Well, not to an extent. Vaccination has enabled the taking of risks that previously would have been unimaginable. In part because, as I said, when you look at January, when you look at all the previous waves, what you saw in terms of ICU occupancy was it was going from 4 to 6 to 8 to 12 to 16 to 20 to 30 to 50 to 70 to 150 to 200. Like that's what was happening. Whereas what we're looking at this time is it's kind of going from 80 to 82 to 84 to 85 to 88. to 90 to 92 to 93, and that's quite a slow process. So if you're thinking of that 200 as the cap, previously once you were at 100 you'd be going, quick, shut everything down because we're going to be at 200 by the end of next week. Now we're going, well, maybe we'll be there in a month, maybe we won't be there in a month. It's much more up in the air. So that's those sort of things are what's driving what appears to be relative lack of action around a thing that is an expanding crisis.
So there's a real wait and see approach, and it's basically the slowness of the ICU beds. Like, how long has it been at 92? Like, I mean, has it been like hovering around there for?
Yeah, it was up at 100. I think did it hit 100 one day? Definitely hit 99. So and a month back, I think it would have been about 60.
Okay, so
your doubling rate is pretty slow in comparison with earlier periods of the pandemic. It's very. I mean, the thing that's quite alarming watching it though is that you get sudden jumps that you don't understand why they've happened. So you get a long plateau, and then suddenly, like one day there were 14 new ICU admissions, and the thing is, like, people can be in ICU for 6 weeks or more. So 14 is like eats a lot of capacity that will stay eaten.
Okay, and then and we're still waiting for the great opening up of nightclubs. That hasn't really registered yet.
Oh, you mean if that has an impact on numbers, Wednesday will be when we start to see that.
Okay. And then, but just from the point of view of being out there, like, I went to the cinema and it was like fully booked because everybody wants to see Dune, and it is good, except it's got a white boy savior in the middle of it. I think it's very strange. But
that's the point.
Yes.
But we won't argue about Dune.
Yeah. But anyway, let's see how that turns out. I don't know. I've forgotten I couldn't remember how the first one turned out. I saw it before and it didn't make any sense to me. This one makes sense to me to a certain point, and obviously I haven't seen the end yet. So, but yeah, like, it totally packed. I mean, we are talking rammed. We got the last two seats in a cinema, like one of the screens, and it was totally monged. And then and then there was this message about obviously you can't, and that's the second time I've been to the cinema. The first time I went, it was much more spaced out because there was spacing taking place, and it was actually very few people in the cinema, and so you wear your mask, and then you put on your mask if you're going to go to the bathroom, but obviously everybody takes off their mask because you're eating popcorn and drinking beer. But it's felt, just with the prevalence of the disease, it doesn't feel a very comfortable place to be. I mean, and I want to go and see another film, but I don't want to go to full screening of, like, I don't know, 200 people.
Well, not to be mean about it, but possibly going to a big blockbuster new film on a Friday night it's not when you're going to get a lot of space in a cinema.
No, but it's all open. It's all open up for business now. Everything's open up.
In a sense, this is exactly the sort of personal responsibility, risk management they're talking about, which is if you arrive somewhere and you see it's full, or they're not checking people's certs or whatever else they're doing, then you should leave again, which it isn't necessarily all that practical a lot of times. Like, it can be quite a big deal not to do something, and
I mean, in fairness, they did check certs and everything else, like, so that's fine. But it's just concerning knowing that the prevalence is just 600 in 100,000 is quite a lot of people. I don't know, when you break it down, divided by 100, what's that?
It's about 1 in 200 people being currently infectious, basically. So if you're in a cinema and there's 200 people in it, the odds are there's at least one infectious person.
And there was a guy coughing, I nearly killed him right in front of me.
So that's the other personal responsibility thing, not going out if you've got symptoms.
Yeah, exactly. Well, he disregarded that thing.
He'd probably done an antigen test.
Maybe in fairness, he's also gone and got a test. And
I mean, this is the difficulty of the phase we're in, because it's also so uneven. Like, I was meant to go to a dance night last night, and I was kind of quite keyed up for that, and then we moved my father's 85th birthday from being 3 or 4 weeks away to next Thursday, and I went, I can't go now.
That's perfect timing.
And I think that is the sort of, like, that's the sort of situation we're in. I'm fairly confident that fully vaccinated, being fairly healthy, my age, COVID probably would be unpleasant, but wouldn't be fatal. I wouldn't end up in ICU. I hopefully wouldn't end up in hospital. That's a reasonable set of risks, but that set of risks is not true of my dad.
No,
so therefore,
85-year-olds won't appreciate it.
I can't go to a dance night on a Saturday and then turn up at his party on the following Thursday, because that's kind of almost the perfect sort of set of timing for onward transmission. So I think that's the kind of, so that's the other aspect, the personal responsibility thing, that I think they probably need to emphasise a bit more, because I don't know how much people are actually thinking about that. Like, people weren't thinking about it enough last Christmas, or even were quite angry about it if you pointed it out to them. And that led to a lot of tragedies. A lot of people ended up being their last Christmas. So I think that is an angle we kind of need to get used to thinking and planning around and adjusting around it. And the other aspect of this is it's really unfair, because, in that situation you described, when the cinemas had more limited capacity, then it was possible for people who were relatively vulnerable, medically speaking, to say, okay, that's a risk I can take because the risk is quite limited.
Not now.
Whereas now, there's no way.
People, that's another...
So my parents were going to restaurants, but there's no way they could go to a restaurant.
It's another interesting point, because basically then personal responsibility means everybody for themselves, and it means that it's survival of the fittest. It's not like it's what's that word, Hobbesian or whatever. It doesn't feel, that's why it kind of feels like it needs to be managed a bit better than personal responsibility. But you're never going to get that in this drive towards opening up again. I don't think it was ever on the cards.
No, and there isn't, like as I said, there isn't really... Yeah. You could keep things at reduced capacity is about the only in-between thing you could actually do. But of course, all the business owners for that are screaming about that, because they can't make enough money if they're running at reduced capacity. And again, coming into Christmas, that's when a lot of money is made for a lot of places. So they're particularly keen. So we're kind of like all the problems we had last December, we will have this December. But,
except we have vaccinated.
But
that's the only thing that's saving us from total disaster.
Exactly. So
again,
that limits things. But, so the thing I'm really underlining is that, if people are thinking of spending Christmas with people who are elderly or vulnerable, you need to, and I think I said this last year as well, you need to be thinking about restricting your movements from about the 10th of December onwards, So the usual Christmas routine most of us do of hitting pubs all the way up to Christmas and then going back to the parents and the grandparents for dinner, it will not be a smart thing to do.
I know,
this year,
and just because you didn't do it last year, doesn't mean you can do it this year, because it's still going to be the same.
Yeah,
case.
I remember one of the commentators, might have been your man Sam McConkey, I can't remember, but suggested that people postpone Christmas until into January and got lambasted from every quarter. But it was precisely on that sort of calculation.
Go to places where the numbers are going to be lower.
Yeah. Like if you do lots of socialising and then you're having family Christmas dinners, that's a recipe for a disaster. So if you could have that family Christmas dinner in mid-December after you've all been sitting at home doing nothing for 2 months, that would work out. But of course, culturally, that's just like... it's a great sort of policy wonk solution to it in terms of it works on paper, but of course in practice, that's not what people are going to be doing.
It feels like we're in the middle of a lot of things being worked out on paper, but the reality is totally different for people. And also, I just think the timeline, just given the length of time that we're in this thing, it's obviously having an adverse effect on people. But when people have the chance to go out, they are going out. Like it's inevitable that's going to happen. Okay, is there anything else? Oh yeah, somebody talked about a variant. Is there some variant? Like, is there another variant just?
Yes, there's. So basically all our variants in future are probably going to be variants of Delta itself, because Delta's just out competing everything else. So
most dominant, yes.
All the other variants that we were a bit worried about, the gammas and the betas and all those, some of whom actually evade immunity more than Delta is, but they all seem to be getting squeezed out to elimination, right? Just because Delta transmits so much faster.
Right.
They've got a sub-lineage of Delta detected in England that seems to be about 10% fitter. Like it transmits reaches about 10% more people or something, which is obviously not good news. Although the silver lining to Delta being so bad is that actually the fractional difference adding 10% to something that's very hard to control it's still very hard to control. Basically, it doesn't make that much difference,
Right.
but it definitely makes things a little harder. I mean, people are much more.
What's the possibility of a variant like that then becoming the new variant? I mean,
Oh, it will over time. That's
Yeah.
because that's the way. I mean, if you get one that's got an advantage, then over time it will squeeze out the others.
Yeah.
That's the way that works. But I mean the concern isn't so much with that, but getting a variant that combines the ability to infect a lot of people fast that Delta has with the ability to evade immunity around the existing vaccines. That's the thing that would be a real disaster if that was to actually happen.
Oh yeah. Okay, so Delta doesn't do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nor the new variant doesn't.
Yeah, and it could even be though if you got that would just apply to infection, but it wouldn't impact hospitalization and ICU and deaths so much. So there's I mean like all this has been watched nervously by people,
Right.
and it's pretty hard to really make solid predictions on it.
Okay. Have we got any big dates coming up where the statesmen address the nation and tell us what we're going to do, or is it all just wait and see?
I think at the moment it's kind of monitoring the numbers and seeing where it's going. I mean,
And
Nefford are kind of back to. They've done press conferences 2 weeks in a row. HSE didn't do one last week. They did their first one once the previous week. That all suggests that that we're gonna I basically think the next couple of months at least are going to be pretty dicey, and I would not be surprised if that's the situation into March, April, basically, when the improvement in the weather base might start to shift things back a bit. But going on from what happens in England when they opened up, they did it at a lower level of vaccination, so we do have an advantage there. But it still does look like, even if now maybe it will turn out the cases stay decreasing, maybe it won't. But even if it does, that would still imply you're looking at kind of months of quite high caseloads, relatively high hospitalizations and things from those quite high caseloads. And in the context of winter, all the other things that are sending people to hospital as well. So, yeah.
And what about, or have we got any flu yet? I mean,
yes, they detected 2 cases.
Right.
Flu has arrived. There was 1 case the previous week, I think 2 cases last week. Now, the thing about flu case detection, it's not, as you kind of know, it's not like COVID where they're swabbing people left, right and centre looking for it. There would normally be hospital admissions, or I think there's 60 GPs that act as sentinels, so they do quite a lot of flu tests. But you'd be talking about thousands of flu tests in a month, not tens of thousands in a day. So if we're picking up 1 or 2, that probably indicates that there's dozens or hundreds. Okay. But that's still quite a low number for this time of year. It maybe the flu will stay more under control than RSV. But
because people are out there wearing masks and doing all that.
And the thing about flu is the R value of flu it pretty much goes below 1 in the summer and above 1 in the winter.
Right.
A little bit more complicated than that, but it doesn't go much above 1. Right. So it kind of spreads and transmits, but not that many people get it. Right. Although we all feel we get it. And so, even things that make marginal differences in terms of not going into work if you're sick, wearing a mask, all that sort of stuff, might actually be enough to mostly keep flu suppressed.
Okay.
Flu does have the same problem with COVID, that if it gets into vulnerable settings like nursing homes, hospitals, or whatever else, it can infect quite a few people. And actually, that was one other thing. I mean, people will be... Something that came to my mind is, people are kind of aware of MRSA in terms of hospitals, superbug, and the problems that caused. And if you think about it, COVID is a hyper-ballistic version of exactly the same problem. If it gets into a hospital, it infects people much, much easier. So MRSA was typically killing a bit over 200 people a year in the hospitals. COVID could be that for the next decade, for the next 2 decades, you'd be talking about, 500 or thousands hospital-acquired infection deaths, because COVID's so infectious and it will keep catching people when they're vulnerable. So yeah,
That's going to be prevalent in hospitals.
There'll be like, so, you know, like the idea that we're going to be able to stop looking for it or whatever at some point is probably nonsense, because it's going to always be a problem. We'll not necessarily be testing the entire society, but it could well be that, you know, tests for entry into healthcare settings, etc., will continue to be a major thing. You know, it's going to be a major problem for nursing homes and visitors is the other obvious thing. So there's a whole load of problems that are going to be, you know, it may well be this time next year, a lot of society will have got back to 100% normal, but you know, hospital-like settings, probably not. They're going to have change. Yeah, it's going to be with them for a long time.
So the takeaway is it's just wait and see again, but it's also a long winter with no exit. That's what you're saying.
I think the other thing that's worth saying is that, I mean, we can't, like, realistically, I don't think we can stay locked up even on an individual level. You know, so the thing I don't like about this phase is the fact that it's kind of forcing people who are quite vulnerable to isolate, and also people who are quite concerned about it are doing the same sort of thing. And we know that's having all sorts of implications in terms of mental health, in terms of people not seeking treatment for other things fast enough, and all that sort of stuff. So the other end up of that personal behaviour stuff is the need to do a risk-benefit assessment, where if you want to go to the cinema, to pick that example, you know, you go, well, I don't want to be in that situation of being in a completely full cinema, so I'll go at 3:00 in the afternoon on a Wednesday. But I'll still get to see the cinema, so I'll get most of, or maybe even all of the experience. I never like crowded cinemas, so I would have tended to do that anyway, rather than sort of going, I'm just not going to go out at all. You know, and I think I am, like, from feedback I'm getting from doing my daily updates and people asking me questions and that, I think it's one of the things that I don't like is that people are feeling pushed back inside again and are not doing things, and I kind of, you know, like, that's, you know, which I understand why that's happening, but can you do that for 6 more months? Can you do it for a year? Can you do it for 5 years? You know, like, it's pretty hard. So yeah,
exactly. Well, also just picking up the phone and talking to people would be good as well, if you know that people are in that situation. Having the chats, I think, is important to try and stay linked in.
And I think, like, the key thing I would say is, we all get annoyed by this personal responsibility stuff, partially because of the way it was used earlier in the pandemic, but realistically, actually, it is going to be a pretty key thing going forward. Like, there's all sorts of structural barriers, sick pay, like all the stuff we've talked about throughout the pandemic, but it is actually still a kind of real thing that within whatever you can do, you need to be thinking around it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just an extension of social solidarity, but and that's totally acceptable. It's just the bit that is a bit hypocritical is that where all of it is in personal responsibility. And on the other side, sure, let's open up coppers. You know, I mean, that's the part that's really jarring. But I mean, it doesn't mean that you go into work if you're feeling sick, if you can avoid it, obviously. Okay, Andrew, that's great. Thanks for that update.
All right.